Hey there, members of the Night Crew, and folks who just love horror. Welcome to the Night Crew podcast, the podcast where we get cozy with the creepy, the frightening, and the just plain undead. I'm your host, Brad Ricks. Now, today is August 25th, which means it's my birthday. So for today's episode, we're switching things up a bit. The tables have turned. I'm not the host today. I turned the reins over to my good friend Courtney and have become the guest of my own podcast. I hope you enjoy learning a little bit about the man behind the microphone. All right, so joining me in the virtual studio today, I have Courtney DeGuire. You may be thinking, who is Courtney? Well, she's a rando that I just pulled off the street. No, not really. So Courtney is actually, so I'm part of a book club here local to Belton and, Belton where I live. And she actually runs our little spooky book club. But for today's episode, since today is my birthday, I asked Courtney, would she like to interview me so that instead of me interviewing somebody else, this is all about me because it's my day. So, So Courtney, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Now it's funny because I said this evening because that's when we're recording because it's not really recording this on my birthday. My podcast drops in the morning. So when you're listening to this, you're like, it's in the evening where he's at. But so I appreciate you, volunteering or accepting my invite to be the guest host for the day for today's episode.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's exciting to be the guinea pig, I guess. And I would like to start by telling you happy birthday, a couple weeks early. But like you said, when this drops, it's going to be your big day.
That's true. Yeah. It's not like it's a big number at all. It's just that now I have a podcast. And so it's all about me. So
your birthday should always be all about you.
That's true. It doesn't matter what year. So. All
right. So let's get it started. Since it is your birthday, I do want to ask, how old are you going to be this year? 21, 22?
So I stopped trying to say, that I'm 21 when my 21st birthday turned 21. So when my 21st birthday was old enough to drink, I was like, well, screw this. No, I will be 47 this year.
Awesome. Well, happy 47th. So let's get started. Everyone's very favorite question in the world. Brad, tell us about yourself. What got you into writing? Give us a little bit of your background.
Little of my background. My name is Brad Ricks, and I've been writing pretty much all my life. I've always had some kind of a creative outlet, creative spark that I've done. When I was in junior high and high school, I used to write short stories. I very infamously, I guess I'd say, I wrote a story. It's hearkened to a Stephen King story where a guy's he's stranded on a deserted island. And so I wrote a story about that, and he starts eating parts of his body and because he's starving, and the teacher did not read it ahead of time. And so she just as she was reading, I wrote it in a diary format, and she turned the page, and the next line was oh my God, the human body tastes like chicken. And she was like, well, we're done with this story now. So yeah, so that's kind of funny. But so I wrote short stories when I was in high school, and then I found the guitar, and I learned to play the guitar when I was a junior in high school. And at that point, my creative outlet turned to music, and I did more songwriting and stuff like that. And that was pretty much the area that I lived in all the way until, probably not even that long ago. And during COVID, I was like, I'm kind of an exercise in discipline. I was like, I wonder if I can sit down and write a novel. I was in between jobs, and my wife and I had just got back from our honeymoon, and I had some inspiration. We were in Italy, and I was like, ooh, I'm going to write this adventure novel, kind of like a Dan Brown, Indiana Jones kind of thing. And I wrote it, and I really enjoyed it. It's in a drawer, will never, ever see the light of day because it is not good. But I did it. And I got to a point where I wrote the end on something, and it's an amazing feeling. And then, but once once the dam kind of burst, that was it, and from there I was like, I don't know why I'm writing adventure. I love horror. That's what I've always since I was a kid reading Edgar Allan Poe, I've loved horror. So I was like, no, I need to write horror stuff. And I remember wanting to read some vampire stuff, and there wasn't any good vampire that was like in horror. It was all in the romance section. I was like, why in the hell is vampires in romance? That's not where they belong. And so I was kind of frustrated. I was like, I'm going to write a vampire novel that is going to be just a fun, vampires are bloody killer vampire novel. And thus was born The Night Crew. So once that happened, by then all of my, the creative juices were flowing, and I now had 2 novels kind of under my belt, and only one that I'm like proud of, and that's the name of the podcast. But but that's kind of how I got started in doing this. It was, I wrote The Night Crew, and somehow was lucky enough for it to get picked up by a publisher, and then from there others, followed along.
All right. So going back to like that teacher, you said, hey, the human body tastes like chicken. She's kind of like, yes. Okay, this is over.
Yep.
How did you kind of work past that like rejection? Because I remember as a kid, I wrote a story about my grandparents being cannibals, and I got suspended. So after that, I never wrote another story again. So did you have any teachers that like fostered that love of horror writing, or was it just kind of like?
Yeah. So when I remember in junior high, I loved reading. I kind of even before then, I was a huge like Hardy Boys fan. And so I did that stuff. And somehow, and I don't remember how, but I transitioned from Hardy Boys to, we probably had read like The Telltale Heart or something like that, or The Cask of Amontillado in school. And I was like, this stuff is cool. And so then I remember reading the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe. And, I was immersed in Poe. And I remember I was like, it's either 7th or 8th grade. I had a teacher who was like, well, if you like Edgar Allan Poe, and she gave me a copy of The Dark Tower. And so then I had Stephen King's The Dark Tower. And then from that moment on, I was definitely lost to anything other than horror. And so, I was fortunate to have some teachers who were very, I guess, open and very supportive of that. And then as I got to writing, all the short stories and things that I wrote tend to be very much more on the macabre side of things. So it just was natural to the point where, and I actually talked on another podcast about, I don't think we were recording. I have to go back and listen to the podcast. It may have been after we got done, but I so much loved, diving in, and especially like Edgar Allan Poe. He was more so Poe than King, actually, because I love how Poe uses the setting and the environment as almost its own character in his stories. And I remember I read so much and learned so much about his life that my senior year in high school, the teacher had said that if other students in other grades wanted to write something about Poe, they could use me as a reference. Like she made me an authoritative reference for Edgar Allan Poe because I had done so much studying and about his style and his life and things like that.
Okay, so that's pretty cool. So definitely big on the Edgar Allan Poe for inspiration, a little bit of Stephen King. You have any other horror inspirations?
Not so much from the horror. I mean, those are probably the 2 big. Well, I say that. I mean, I do enjoy Shirley Jackson, the Haunting of Hill House, and I enjoy that stuff. But no, I mean, I do enjoy kind of a mix of genres when I read. I have a lot of classics. I love, one of my favorite books is Tale of Two Cities is one of my favorites. The Count of Monte Cristo is another one of my favorites. That one to me is like the blueprint for revenge. So that's one that I really enjoy. So those kind of things, that are very much steeped in deep plot and storytelling or something that I just kind of tend to gravitate towards.
So you've got Fear Not the Dead, To Hell With Hallmark, which I believe is a novella.
It would classify as a novella. Yeah, it's or a short story collection. Yeah, that kind of thing.
The Night Crew. And then, of course, you have The Night Crew 2 coming out in November, which I'm very excited about. But out of everything that you've written, and this can include short stories, because I definitely need to brush up on some of your short stories and find those. What is your favorite thing that you've ever written?
I like the world that I'm building with The Night Crew. And so that's probably my favorite, just because of the whole, and by the way, Night Crew wasn't meant to be a series when I first wrote it. It developed, like, you kind of let your characters kind of roam at times. And as I was writing it, I let some of the characters just kind of started talking. And when they did, they started talking about like the council and the accords and all this stuff that you read about in the Night Crew. And as I was doing that, I was like, holy crap, I just made a world. And so this world is kind of unraveling, and that with each book of the Night Crew, you'll kind of see I've number 2 is coming out. Number 3 has already been written and will come out next July. It's in the first round of editing phase right now. And so that'll be out next July. So this world, so it's probably my favorite because of that. Now I will say the one that I hear about the most, and I of course get them, and everybody keeps talking about and get the most. I don't want to say the word funnest because I know that's not really a word, but that's what it is. That's To Hell With Hallmark, because that one, it was such a blast to write. Oh yeah, although I love the storyline of Night Crew, To Hell With Hallmark was fun to write.
I'm not gonna lie, To Hell with Hallmark is absolutely my favorite, just because I am so big on holidays and tropes, and it was just fun. Like, that's definitely going to be a Christmas reread every year for me.
I appreciate that. Well, and so what's funny, so I don't know if you know this story, but you were there actually at kind of when it was birthed, I will say. So I usually tell the story of how I was sitting with my grandmother, and she was at a nursing home, and it was around Christmas time. And that's what was on TV, was the Hallmark Christmas movies. And so we were like, and after watching so many, I was like, Mama, I was like, something really bad needs to happen to these people. And she was like, oh, Brad, and just kind of laughed it off. So at the signing, when I did the release party for Fear Not the Dead, I was telling people that story. And I know you were there and probably amongst the crowd somewhere. And I was telling that story, and I remember I think it was you and Chris and a couple others were like, yeah, you should write that. That would be awesome. And so that was kind of what gave me the inspiration to like, yeah, I think I could do this. And so I, at that point, was like, I put the other project I was working on, I put it on hold, and which I think might have been Night Crew 2 at that point, but I had put the other project I had on hold, and I sat down and I was like, let's see if how fast I can write, this little novella. And the publisher was like, well, if you can get it to me by this time, we can put it out this year. And so that was pretty much like every morning and every night I was sitting in front of the computer, just typing away short, these crazy little stories, happening in the most beautifulest little town of Hallmark.
I love that one, especially Goliath. I'm a big fan of his. So you wrote that pretty fast and you stopped in the middle of a project. So how do you find that you're able to not really hit like writer's block? Or if you did, like, how did you overcome it and then still be able to jump right back into the other project?
So I wouldn't say I jumped right back into the other project. I remember I had to kind of start back from the beginning of it and reread what I had written to kind of get myself back into the mindset of it. I am not one. I know of people who can kind of jump between projects and somehow they keep them straight. I can't even really read 2 books at one time and keep them straight. So there is no way I'm writing 2 books at a time and keeping them straight. And I wasn't bouncing back and forth. I was like, pause, write this other one, and then go back and reread what I wrote. So yeah, there was no kind of bouncing back and forth. And then from a writer's block standpoint, I've so far in my short little writing career, I've been fortunate. I haven't really kind of stumbled upon some major writer's block. Some of the things I have read and I have kind of looked into in regards to writer's block, a lot of it has to do, from what my opinion on writer's block, some of it has to do with if you're trying to make the characters do things that they wouldn't naturally do, then it's like you're really stuck because you're trying to, again, like I say, you're trying to force your characters. If you just let your characters act naturally and let things just naturally progress, then as long as you have those well-developed characters that you have, they have their own personalities and they have their own motivation and intention, then you let them carry the story. And then you don't really have writer's block because you're not really writing the story. You're just documenting what they're doing.
That makes sense, because It's kind of like when you try to force yourself to do something, like you kind of hit that block. And I guess your characters, would you describe them as an extension of yourself?
At times, yes.
I mean, they are your brainchild. So,
I mean, there's usually a little piece of the writer in every character. I mean, it's very hard to completely separate yourself from the character because, yeah, I mean, you are creating them. They're your little children.
even the bad ones.
Even the bad ones. I have, a house full of teenagers, even the bad ones.
Even the bad ones. So how did it feel when you first got picked up by a publisher? And what was the process for that? Because that's one thing, like you write a book, what do you do?
It's a great question because there is the typical process, like if you're querying agents and doing all that kind of stuff, which I was at the time when Night Crew got picked up. I was out sending it to agents and praying it wouldn't just landing in some, slush pile somewhere that somebody would never respond about, which it pretty much did. But so I happened to, I think I was on Facebook, see an ad for a publisher that was, doing a kind of an open call. And so I was like, okay. And I filled out their little submission thing, which was, I think, some little query letter in the first couple chapters. And I remember I was on a work trip and I was actually in Oklahoma. I think I was in Tulsa, and I'd gotten an email from the publisher. It was like, hi, we read the first chapters of the Night Crew, and we would like we're requesting a full manuscript. And I remember immediately like calling my wife, and I was like, oh my God, I have gotten a full request, because that's kind of like that first, that like after the, that's not to an acceptance yet, but once you get that full request, it's like, oh, the first little bit hooked them, and so yeah, so that was amazingly wonderful. And then I remember it was later, about a month or so later. It was actually on Father's Day. I remember that it was that morning. I had gotten the email that said, we would like to sign the Night Crew to a contract. And I was like, holy crap, this is a great Father's Day present. And so, yeah, that was my, first book that got picked up. So yeah. So although Night Crew was the first one that got picked up because of publishing schedule, Fear Not the Dead ended up being the first one that came out, and the Night Crew got kind of pushed back a little bit, but it was the first one that got picked up and the first one that really introduced me into the indie horror world.
Okay. So that's a fun fact you have never told us at the book club. So I have learned something new today. Yes. I did not know Night Crew was your first.
Yes. It had initially got picked up by Wicked House Publishing, and then there was some scheduling issues and things like that. And so Wicked House was talking with Crystal Lake and publishing and was like, is there anything in our schedule you would like? And Joe over Crystal Lake was like, I want Night Crew. And so he picked up Night Crew. Then I had to kind of fit in their schedule, which ended up being this February of 25 was when it came out. And I've love the change. Crystal Lake has been great to work with, and Joe has a ton of confidence in my Night Crew series, and it is actually very humbling. He is the support and stuff that he has kind of put behind, my little vampires, and so it's been very, very humbling, the support and stuff they have given me. But yeah, so whenever in the meantime of all that happening, I didn't just like write one book and was like, okay, let's just hope this works. I kept writing. And so Fear Not the Dead was the next one I had written. And I kind of started shopping it around, and it had gotten picked up pretty quick by Unveiling Nightmares. And then when all the change happened with Night Crew, I asked Unveiling Nightmares, hey, do you mind putting Fear Not the Dead in the spot where Night Crew was going to go? So Night Crew was initially supposed to come out July of 24, and instead Fear Not the Dead did.
So that's how all that started then.
Yes.
Do you have any regrets about Fear Not the Dead being your debut, or do you feel pretty good about that being the debut and then you're transitioning like, hey, now I got my series?
No, I don't have any regrets about it being the debut. I mean, I've learned a lot since then about how to do marketing better and ARC readers, and how to kind of build that little support community. So I've learned a lot. And like if I was to re-release Fear Not the Dead, I would have a lot more ARC readers and things like that for it. But even then, it's kind of its little engine. It's like my little engine that could. Because I'll occasionally still see it kind of pop up, and I pitch it all the time. People are always looking for good ghost stories and thrillers and that, and so I'll throw it into the chats all the time, and I usually get very good and positive feedback and review on it. So no, I don't at all regret that being my debut novel. And then, like I said, then of course, To Hell With Hallmark came out after that, and everybody loved that one. So
we all did. And it was perfect timing because we did the signing with the Krampus party here. So everyone should come to Texas and celebrate with us this year. So yeah, I love Fear Not the Dead. I thought it was a really great debut, but I just didn't know that Night Crew was your first. And you were talking about how your little world of vampires. So that's pretty fascinating to me. That was actually your first project.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, cut this part out. I'm freezing. I had a question and it left my mind. Yes, you have to cut this part out. I'll pass out if I hear this. I froze. Okay.
Courtney is new to the hosting world, so please forgive her.
Yeah, I don't like public speaking. This is huge for me. So, marketing. You're being an indie author. What are your biggest challenges? Because I find it definitely marketing. I definitely find the indie author world interesting though, because you all have to do so much self-promotion and to find that balance between life and all of that. How do you do it?
Lots of caffeine, coffee. Yeah. So no, it is a great community, and we do a lot of, kind of lifting each other, call it, the rising tide lifts all ships. And so we do a lot of promoting each other as well as ourselves. Whenever somebody's asking about, different books, if they're like, oh, tell me about a good vampire book out there, I'll say, oh, I have one. Also, there's this book called Down in the Hollow, which is also a really good vampire, novel that's done by an indie author. Or if they're like, what's a good haunted house book? I'm like, oh, well, I've got one called Fear Not the Dead, but there's also ones like The Suffering. And so you're pitching and promoting each other, out on the socials and things like that. And we all tend to be very supportive of each other. So that in and of itself really helps, because we're all kind of, driving and helping to kind of pick everybody up at the same time. And you see it in events as well. We go to different like AuthorCon and things like that, and somebody will say, oh, well, I'm really more interested in like YA. And we go, oh, well, who has good YA is, this guy, or, John Ward around the corner has a really good, series. And so we each read each other's stuff, and a lot of us are, ARC readers for each other. And because of that, like we're very familiar with what other folks are writing. And so it really, like I said, the community itself is awesome. And it really helps to that self-promotion we have to do. We also can kind of lean on each other. Whenever we have a post, we'll put a post out, and then I'll in a chat say, hey, y'all, does anybody mind sharing that out? And next thing I know, it's got 24 shares. And that all of my readers are ones who, like a John Ward or Andrew Nyberg or some of these other indie authors, my readers aren't necessarily ones who are familiar with them. Their readers aren't necessarily familiar with me. And so as we share each other's stuff with our groups, we're helping to, again, do that good cross promoting.
I think that's awesome how the art world does tend to support each other like that, though. Mm-hmm. And I love that you guys build each other up. Like the Facebook group, I have found so many just from like you commenting on it where we're friends. Like I found so many books on there, and I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. So I do love that you guys do that.
Yeah. And it is, as I said, it's super supportive. Like, for instance, as we're doing this recording, this previous weekend was Books and Brews. And I wasn't there to sell. I didn't sell any books there. I was just there as a volunteer, helping out, didn't have a table. So afterwards, I posted, I was like, hey, if you still got some money left over, here's my website. And I had a lot of people who were authors there who went ahead, who shared out my post about, hey, go to Brad's website and buy some of his books. So, it's just that kind of support is what, we do a lot in the community.
How was Books and Brews? What was your favorite part?
So yeah, it was quite awesome. So the readings were pretty cool. Hearing some of the different readings. I was able to kind of rub elbows with a few bigger names. Clay McLeod Chapman was there, and I got to hang out with him again. I was hanging out with Thomas Huvolt, which I know I'm going to say his last name wrong probably, but he's the one who wrote Hex. Felix Blackwell was there. He stopped by. And so chatted a lot with him. He's a really nice guy. Mark Clyer. And then also, well, I know, Rachel Harrison, who I was a nice, good friend and got Rachel to do a video saying hi to Courtney. And for those of you who don't know, Courtney she's pregnant right now. And so she's nice and emotional. So I sent her a video and I'm certain made her cry.
I cried as soon as I got it. And then I was driving to my friend's house later that day and I thought about it and I cried again because I thought it was so nice. So thank you. But I did enjoy it. And you had done AuthorCon the weekend before that, if I'm correct.
I did the Texas AuthorCon. Yeah, it was 2 weeks ago. It was a Texas AuthorCon. And that was up in Irving.
And you did actually have your own table at that.
I did have my own table there. Yeah. And that was really fun.
So having your own table versus volunteering, like what do you love the most about having your own table? Like how do you get people to come to the table and all of that?
So carnival barking, I guess is what it's called.
Okay. Step right up.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's all about engaging with people. As a reader or as a customer in general, if you're walking past a table and somebody is just sitting in a chair back on their phone and they're not engaging, then you're probably not going to engage with them either, especially if there's somebody who's brand new to you and you don't know. So I'm always standing up. I don't care how long it is. If it's 6 hours or 8 hours, I am standing up in my booth. And as people are walking by, I'm like, hi, how's it going? And just trying to get a little bit of interest. And then, once they come by, I'm like, well, tell me what it is you like to read. And, usually people, if it's a mixed genre type event, like the Texas Author Reader Con is, then usually they'll say something like, someone will be like, oh yeah, I love horror. Or they'll may say, well, I'm kind of more of a thriller person. And then at that point, it becomes all sales. It's all like, well, let me tell you about my book, Fear Not the Dead, because it's actually more of a psychological thriller that's set in a haunted house. It reads more like a cat and mouse game than it does that, your typical horror aspect. So, so then it just becomes a sales and you try to fit your product with their needs.
So speaking of horror, which is probably what this whole podcast is about, but going back to writing horror versus thriller, how do you invoke horror in writing? Like what does it for you? And when you're reading, like personally, what gets to you? Like for me, it's body horror. It doesn't scare me, but it makes me so uncomfortable. I'm like, yes, I love this feeling. This is awful.
So I don't read a lot of the extreme horror stuff. So, I mean, which is funny because I have written a short story that was body horror, but I don't typically read a lot of it really, really kind of that gross extreme stuff. Horror for me, it's a lot about tension building. And that to me, I actually talked about this on a horror panel at the Texas AuthorCon, that it's a lot about pacing. When you're writing something, let's take an example like in Fear Not the Dead, for instance. It is in a haunted house, and you do have these scenes where a kid is walking down a hall. Well, I don't say he went out this one door, he ran down the hall, he ran in the other door. No, you talk about every little thing, there's with each step, he hears the creak of the floorboard, the breeze blows past and brushes across the hairs on his neck. Like you make the reader kind of feel everything. And it's just growing tension as it's happening, where that to me is where like a lot of that horror, and especially like, one thing that's real hard to do in books is getting that jump scare. But if you can just really drive out that tension and that fear aspect of things, and then just in a sudden burst, just I always call it like almost like a stretching of a rubber band and then snapping it, then you can somewhat get that in your writing, is being able to get that kind of a jump scare all of a sudden. It's like, then they turn the corner and that's where he got stabbed. And, just like suddenly it just happens. So, you just kind of let that build up. To me, that's where a lot of that from a horror aspect, you kind of drive that tension and that unease and make the reader feel every little thing as if they're there.
I will say that Fear Not the Dead has one of my favorite like little jump scares in it. You have a really good one in there, and I'm not going to spoil it for anyone because I demand that everyone read it. You probably know what I'm talking about though, because I was sitting up by myself reading it and I was like, I have to go to bed.
I'll just say, is it when she's laying in bed?
Yes. And then I didn't even want to like look at my husband that night because I was like, I'm scared to roll over. Like, I just have to lay here.
I've heard that scene from others is one that was like made them a little, uneasy. So what's funny, you talk about, at Books and Brews, for instance, it reminds me. So, Felix Blackwell's there, Stolen Tongues. There's scenes in Stolen Tongues that is really creepy. And it typically has to deal with what's going on with the wife night when it's just the two of them, the husband and wife that are there. And so it must be something about like when it's, that husband and wife dynamic and something's happening to one that doesn't know it. And because it's the same kind of thing in the scene you're talking about in Fear Not the Dead is that same kind of, and usually there is some interesting little, you can play on some different fears in that being able to where there is that, when it's, that you have that husband and wife and you have that intimate where somebody where the most vulnerable you are is when you're sleeping next to somebody and, you wake up and it's not the person or they're randomly talking in a language that they don't know, or they're, just that at that moment, it's, there is something very creepy and very scary about that.
Definitely. Yeah. Cause I did not want to like roll over and look at my husband for like a couple of days in a row. I was like, no. And I think that in the Night Crew, you did a really good job of like with the pacing, like, I don't want to do a spoiler. It's not really a spoiler, but like the old school, like everything said in there is just such good, like pacing. You get that dread. You're like, oh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen?
So that was really one that. So in that scene, it was something I purposefully had to almost slow things down there because in a lot of that book kind of borderlines on action and horror. It is very much, I call it, Blade-esque in that sense where it kind of threads that needle. So as I was writing it and I was getting to kind of the climactic stuff at the end, I realized I was like, how much am I stepping away from having a fear aspect and horror to this just being an action movie? And I was like, so I like had to make a conscious effort to, I want to slow this down. I want to, add in elements that are going to be more fear inducing to make sure I still am sitting on the fence of horror and action and not just completely falling into the.
So for Fear Not the Dead, we obviously know you love vampires, or not Fear Not the Dead. I'm sorry. There I go again. For the Night Crew, we know you love vampires.
Yes.
What would you say were your biggest inspirations behind your world of vampires? Because we all know you have the Edward Cullens who sparkle in the sunlight. You have the ones who can only be staked. We have the Buffy vampires. So what were your big inspirations?
So when I started with the Night Crew, I wanted to kind of take things back to just like Dracula. I want to take things almost, I want to say, to the beginning, because even Dracula pulled inspiration from other stuff. If you listen to other episodes of the Night Crew podcast, you'll hear all about the different history of the vampires. But shameless plug for the podcast that you're listening to anyway. But
do what you got to do, self-promote.
Damn Skippy. And so I wanted to take things back to some of what really has begun our pop culture vampire. And it was Dracula. That was really, that's what created the vampire craze that we have today. And so I went back to that. And in Dracula, it's not a stake through the heart will work. But at the end, they end up cutting his head off, and then but sunlight doesn't kill him. And, there's those kind of things. And so I wanted to kind of harken back to that. And it's not just, being bitten and suddenly you're now a vampire. There is that exchanging of blood. That's why, him and I always get the two backwards, but him and Mina had the connection that they did because he was giving her, drops of his blood. And so I want to kind of go back to that. Yes, no, I got way away from the sparkling Edward Cullen vampires and that. So I wanted to do that. And I was definitely inspired. I mean, I'm about to, today's at the time of this podcast, I'm 47 today, which means I was born in 78, and I was definitely a child of the 80s when it comes to vampire, movies and, the 80s and 90s. So you're talking Lost Boys and 30 Days of Night and, those kind of things. And so I wanted those kind of vampires. I didn't want the Interview with a Vampire, Vampire Lestat. I didn't want Vampire Diaries, and I didn't want to be love interest. This isn't I can save him and make him a good vampire. No, I didn't want any of that crap. And so I wanted just nice, good killing vampires.
I think you succeeded in that. Like, I did listen to your podcast with Mr. Scipione. I probably butchered that, but I remember you mentioning the Lost Boys, and I was like, yes, I can see that. I freaking love the Lost Boys. That was one of my first vampire movies, and it's a classic. So I definitely love that you pulled from that.
Yes.
What is your favorite vampire movie? You can only pick one.
Probably the Lost Boys. That one. I even have a t-shirt in my closet for the Lost Boys. So probably that one. It's so good.
It is good. If you'd picked any other movie, you would have been wrong.
The right way to answer that would have been, what is your favorite vampire movie and why is it the Lost Boys?
You're right. I need to rephrase that. So why are vampires your favorite monster?
So for me, vampires, just of any other creature, there was always you lost your sense of you. When you take the werewolf, for instance, when the wolfman, when we would change from, being this nice person into a wolf, a werewolf, and then suddenly he's killing people and he comes back and he was like, oh, I hate that I did this. And, there was always, whatever it was always they lost their sense of self. But the vampire, especially if you think of Dracula, I mean, he's just he is who he is, and this is what he does. And, the same with, and things like the Lost Boys or 30 Days of Night and those, yes, they're vampires and they know they're vampires and this is what they do and they don't care. And so, and I just that, I think I've talked about on the podcast where, they're everything that we want. They're immortal. They're, typically just suave and they just kind of go through life carefree. And, they don't have to worry about getting a tan. So, but yeah. And so, but for me, it was if I had to pick a creature to become, it was I want one where I'm still me. And so, and that always tended to be, at least the way it's portrayed in movies and books and stuff, is it's the vampire. Outside of the strain gets a little weird. And so I'll just kind of set that aside. I don't know what Guillermo del Toro was thinking, but I do enjoy the strain. The shows were okay. The books were good, but I mean, that gets way into being a worm and all that kind of stuff. Is just weird. So we won't get into the strain from the vampire standpoint.
Now I kind of want to force you to get into it, but I won't make you. Do you have a favorite book, vampire or not vampire? What's your favorite book that you think everyone should read?
So when it comes to you're talking about just horror or just in general? I
want to say horror because we're talking about scary stuff, but this is also your birthday. So tell us your favorite.
So when it comes to horror, there are three, if I was okay, these three are kind of the epitome of horror. I kind of put them into you said one and I'm picking three. So it's mine. It's my podcast.
I'll allow it.
So I think I would go with Dracula, Frankenstein, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Really sticking with the classics.
I stick with the classic because those are just the where everything stemmed from is those. And so I am I'm a lover of the classics. And so, yeah, those three. And really, to me, those three kind of epitomize a lot of horror, because you have Dracula, who's just evil for the sake of evil. He just does what he does. And Frankenstein is that, man-made evil. It's, you go even to movies in the 50s when it was, like ants and them, and it's all, because of nuclear stuff. Well, it's all stuff that we made. And so it's just that man-made. And then Jekyll and Hyde is that, it's the evil within. It's the werewolf. It's anything where it was kind of hidden inside of you, and then it just comes out. And that's Jekyll and Hyde. And so everything that we know of horror today, to me, is really birthed from those three novels.
Any favorite characters? And these can be your own favorite characters.
So my own favorite character. So I'm really a fan of Nikki in the Night Crew series. So my character is that. Outside of my character, or mine, in Stephen King's world, I love Randall Flagg. So he's the main bad guy in The Stand, which, if I did have to pick just one novel that was kind of my favorite, it'd probably be The Stand. I do love that one. The ending's not quite my favorite, but the rest of the book is awesome. But I think Randall Flagg is an awesome character, and he definitely he's in a lot of the King books, and he definitely kind of transcends time, and his characterization from story to story. It's him, but at the same time he also adapts to the story that he's in.
So speaking of endings, I'm going to be honest, I've only read a couple of Stephen King books because they're very long. I've been in school for 8 million years. I get burnt out. I need something short.
That's not Stephen King.
No, that's not Stephen King, but I do have Christine was my first Stephen King book, and I absolutely loved it. So Stephen King has this reputation. He can't write an ending. For you, what is the hardest part of a book to write?
I don't necessarily think the ending is the hardest, but it's definitely the middle is the hardest, because I tend to, like, I have these different, how Joe, when I interviewed him, how he kind of does his stuff is very similar to how I do, where I have there's some tent poles that I set up, and, there's things that some benchmarks that I'm trying to get to. And I usually will somewhat write I always call it like a very messy short story that it's really a synopsis is what it is. And, but really that synopsis is just kind of getting me from point A to point B to point C. And I do just a little junk in the middle to fill it out. But when you start writing, you want to make sure, like, you always tend to have, like, this is how I'm going to start it, and it's going to be awesome. And then you always have this is how I'm going to end it, and it's awesome. And then you look at the gap in the middle and you're going, crap, what the hell do I put there? And so, they call it the messy middle. And that's why, is because as a reader, there's a big gulf in between, but as a writer, you got to make sure you're carrying your reader along, and you're not wanting to give away the ending, but you want to keep bringing them along. You want them to keep, trudging along in the story to get to that payoff at the end. And so it is a balancing act of you're answering questions, but you're also posing questions at the same time, so that your reader keeps wanting to turn the page, even through, if it's a 400 or 500 page book, when you're at 250 pages and you're, as a reader, you're looking at it going, wow, I'm halfway through it. I've got another 250 pages to go. But you want it to be interesting enough and have enough questions that they want to keep going, but yet you also want to have answered enough, like I said, so that they don't feel like you're just kind of meandering through for 250 pages.
That gives me a lot more respect, because I never realized, like, the delicate balancing act. Because, there's those books where you're like, this could have been 200 pages shorter. But then you also, on the other hand, have those books where it's like, okay, I need 200 more pages. Why didn't you explain this?
Yeah,
so you got to find that happy medium.
There's some books that I get to the end and I'm like, yeah, there's parts of it where you're like, were you paid by the word? What the hell?
Speaking of word counts, do you hold yourself to a specific word count, like, daily when you write, or, like, what's the process there?
So once upon a time when I first started, and there was once I was even trying NaNoWriMo. For those who don't know, NaNoWriMo is the National Novel Writing Month. It's usually November is what it's set up, and it's supposed to be every day you write 1,600 words, and by the end of the month you have like 55,000 words, and you pretty much have a novel. Well, I've tried that, and I've tried just myself being like, okay, I'm going to try to do 1,000 words a day or something like that. None of that works. You have to find what works for you. I've set now to where my goal is every day, write a little bit. Just make yourself time to write every day. And it doesn't matter if you wrote 10 words. It doesn't matter if you wrote 2,000 words. You still block off that time, get yourself used to this is the time that is dedicated to sit down and doing stuff. And again, you will have those days where you're just staring at a page for, if it's an hour a day, you just stare at a page for an hour and all you've written was, and then they went and got coffee. And then that's like all that you write. But it's still, you're still working on getting yourself, you're training yourself that this is what happens during this time. And the more you do it, it's like working a muscle. The more you do it, the more it's going to be able to, the more you're going to be able to unlock that and do it. And there'll be other days where you just sit down and again, you'll sit down and start typing. And then you look at the clock and an hour and a half has passed and you got 3,000 words. You're like, what the hell did that just happen? But again, like I said, then there's those other times when it's like you sit there for an hour and you got 10 words and you don't know what's going on. And so, yeah, again, to me, it's just making sure that you have that time that you set aside to say, this is what I'm doing. And that to me is more important than trying to say, I must write 500 words a day. Because if you do that, then tomorrow you're going to erase 400.
I think that's some pretty sound advice, because that goes back to what you were saying about like forcing your characters to do something unnatural. You can't force yourself to do something either, or it just, right. That's when that writer's block might hit.
You're going to go back and read it the next day and be like, what the hell was I thinking? And again, like I said, you're going to erase 498 of the 500 words that you wrote. It was a waste anyway. You didn't do any. All you did was just randomly type into a keyboard. You didn't actually do anything productive. So I would rather productively write 10 words than write 500 words of junk.
You have any other advice out there for readers or potential writers?
No, I mean, I think that's the big one is just keep doing it. And it doesn't even matter what form of it you do. And for instance, I'm working on a novel right now, but the other day I said it and I was like, I'm just going to write a little short story. I'm not feeling the novel right now. So I had another little story idea that would be a fun little short story. And so I was like, let me just do it instead. And so I just did that. Or, I'm doing things like this podcast now where I'll sit there and go, I have a good idea for one of my scripted episodes, and I'll go through and start doing some research. And I see doing that research and taking those notes as part of the writing process. And it's still me making progress and moving forward. If I'm looking up how to kill vampires around the world and I'm, copy and pasting little snippets here and there, and that is still, I'm making progress in the story I'm telling and what I'm doing.
Right. Okay. Cut this part out. Is there any other questions you think I should ask? Have I left out anything?
No, not really. I usually ask, hey, where can the readers, or where can people listening find you? But I plug that in the end of the podcast anyway. So
I was going to ask that, but I had two birthday questions that I was going to wrap in with that. So, okay, back to recording.
Back to recording.
All right. So it's been a wonderful evening chatting with you, getting to know you more, hearing more about your inspiration. And I appreciate you having me on the show. I know I'm a big old nobody, but I appreciate you and your listeners.
You are my stalker fan. What are you talking about?
I was. Funny story. I pulled a misery and broke his leg. Actually, that's how we met.
So it was funny whenever I started when I started putting myself out there more in the writing world and trying to market and all that. I had set up my, there's a Brad Ricks author Facebook page that's out there as well. But I had also, I also have my normal Brad Ricks author page, or my normal Brad Ricks Facebook page or profile.
which you posted a lot on and tagged the bookstore.
Yes, I do. And I tagged the bookstore that I did the initial signing for Fear Not the Dead. And so Courtney friended me. And I didn't think anything of it because a lot of people were. And so later on, she was like, I did not mean to tag your personal profile. I was trying to tag your author one. And so I always give her crap that she was, my first stalker. But it was funny because as I was friending a whole bunch of people kind of all over the country who were different writer stuff, and I looked, I was like, hey, this person's from my hometown. But it's because I tagged Blackbird Books and Spirits, which is an awesome place here in Belton. But that's where I did my first book signing. And so I had tagged it, and that's where she found me.
And then afterwards, I felt really creepy, but it spiraled into a beautiful friendship, which I am very grateful for.
Yes, I appreciate it. And I'm part of the book club. And
so I do want to ask, what is your favorite drink?
So I am definitely a bourbon, whiskey person, as y'all can't see, but this whole time I have been having a nice little, I've been sipping this whole podcast. I've been sipping on a Basil Hayden dark rye. So for those of you who are, whiskey and bourbon drinkers out there, I'm sure you're like, that's a good one. Yes, it's probably also why I'm slurring right now. But no, it's actually because it's late. But so no, I am more of a, I enjoy the, things like that. Johnny Walker Gold is another favorite of mine. Some Buffalo Trace. Again, I lean more towards that direction.
Well, you heard the man. Get him a birthday drink. He's going to be out and about. And for your birthday, I don't know what you would like, but I would really like to see some of your books sell. So why don't you tell us where we can find you and drop those release dates for me again? Because I know I'm really excited for the release of The Night Crew too. I've been waiting on it since I read the first Night Crew.
Well, and it's fine. You can go ahead and say you were also a beta reader for Night Crew 2. So
okay. I didn't want to spoil anything, so I am so ready to have that badass cover. Can I say that on here?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I am so excited to have that badass cover on my shelf because you guys can't see it, but I'm actually redoing. I have a whole horror shelf. I have to take away my fantasy books up here, but I'm doing a whole horror shelf.
Nice.
So I'm so excited for that.
Yeah, I'm excited to get that one in my hands. At the time of this recording right now, I actually just today started putting together some of the art team and, started adding people into a Facebook group that I have for it. And I should be having ARC, the PDF or the EPUB soon. And I should be able to start sending that out for folks. But yeah, so Courtney was one of my beta readers, so she got a chance to read it early. So before we do I know we're actually having Night Crew as our book of the month for August. She has to go back and reread Night Crew so that she doesn't give anything away when it comes to Night Crew 2 that she may know.
Especially with pregnancy brain, because I've been conflating everything together, even outside of the book world. So I'm like, I can't tell people that. Oh my gosh.
It's like, no, that's a spoiler.
Yeah, so I've had to really work hard to clamp my tongue.
Yeah, the only thing I have given away in regards to Night Crew 2, it does take place in New Orleans. So that's the only little spoiler I've said in regards to it.
Okay, that's the only thing I will tell people then. So that's dropped. The Night Crew's already out. That dropped in February.
Yep,
the next one drops in November. Yeah, Night Crew 2 will drop in November. I'm hoping. And where can we find you?
So you can, of course, my website, bradricks.com. You can order signed copies of my books there. And I'm always on Facebook. I'm trying to get a better TikTok presence, although I'm, every so often I'm like, hey, I have one new follower. So, definitely follow me on TikTok. I will try to do better about posting crap there. But definitely, like I said, I'm on Facebook usually all the time.
Definitely
I don't do Instagram as much.
Facebook.
If you see me on Instagram, it's actually because it's whatever I post on Facebook went over there. I'm terrible about doing Instagram.
That's how my Instagram is too. I think to be a young hip person, I'm not very tech savvy. I'm not good at the TikTok either, so I don't do that either. I need to get better and help promote my indie authors.
There you go. That would be good.
Well, again, I want to thank you for your time and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's been awesome.
Yeah.
Nerve-wracking, but awesome.
Well, I appreciate you, like I say, accepting my invite to be the guest host for today and interview me. Since, again, like I said, since it was my birthday, I figured it'd be a fun little treat to get interviewed instead of being the interviewer. So I do appreciate you guest hosting for today.
Anytime.
That's it for the Night Crew podcast. I had a blast being the guest and want to thank Courtney for agreeing to host the show today, despite her fears of public speaking. So if you had a good time, make sure to follow the show, share it with a friend, and leave a rating. Hopefully 5 stars. If you want updates on my writing, you can follow me on Facebook or TikTok at Brad Ricks Author. You can find copies of my novels wherever you like to buy books. But if you hop over to my website, bradricks.com, you can purchase signed copies of any of my novels. While there, also sign up for my newsletter. Remember, The Night Crew Book 1 is currently available, and Book 2 comes out in November. I'm Brad Ricks, reminding you to stay out of graveyards after dark, question people who don't show up in mirrors, and pour yourself a generous glass of bourbon. I know I will. Until next time, keep your curtains drawn, your sense of humor sharp, and your blood inside your body. Thanks for listening.